Hello, this is Adrienne Revis, and I am in Comms 520, the D01 class, and I will be talking to you today and presenting the concept of communication accommodation theory. And this theory provides information as a platform to understand how humans adapt when interacting with others. And so basically what it means is providing accommodations to oneself when communicating with another, whether they are from the same background as you are, or from a different background. That way you can properly communicate with one another. And this theory and this concept is so essential to communications because it reveals something that we do in everyday life. It reveals how we adapt our ways of communication to exchange information or inform somebody else, or just even to interact with another properly. And so that's so important to note. And so anyways, the first thing that I'm going to talk about is history, the history of the theory. And Howie Giles was the man who actually came up with the theory. It all began whenever he went to grad school. His very first day of grad school, one of his mentors told him that he needed to come up with a theory. Now think about that. Okay, it's your first day of grad school, and your mentor told you that you were supposed to come up with a theory. He had no idea what to do. So what he did is he started to think about his past, where he came from, things that had happened in everyday life. And so he started thinking about his past, his childhood. He grew up in Wales, so he was playing soccer. Then he went on to go to college in London with those from London. So he had to adapt to a culture. And so he started thinking about how the ways that he interacted with others and communicated with others altered depending on his location or where he was. For example, on the soccer field, he would be more brute and rough and communicate differently with his teammates than he would in college with those in London. In a recent study or a recent video interview from Andrew Ledbetter from Texas Christian University, Howie Giles actually explained how he came up with this theory, and he told them that on the soccer field he acted different, but in the business setting he realized that personally his voice got deeper. And the way that he spoke and the words that he stated in college were different than on the soccer field. And so that's how he showed that our language and the ways that we communicate alter depending on who we're talking to or where we're at, the setting. And so a little bit more about the history is before it was called communications accommodation theory, it was called speech accommodation theory. And the reason for the name change is that over time, Howie Giles and other researchers realized that it was not only speech, it could be verbal or nonverbal, the way that we change our ways and the way that we interact and communicate with others. For example, a handshake. It may be intentional or not intentional, but it is a way of communicating. For example, giving a handshake would be a proper way of communicating, or refusing a handshake could be a way too. It could be a negative way, which leads into the basic concepts of the communication accommodation theory. And that breaks down into two things, which is convergence and divergence. And convergence is how people adapt to be more like the other person that they are communicating with. Okay? An example of this would be, I know that myself, I am from North Carolina. I'm very Southern. You can tell from my dialect. But interacting with someone from New York would be very different. And so I have realized that while at Liberty University, people who talk to me, their voice changes. They have a little twang in their voice when they begin to talk to me. And I think that's totally relatable to this theory and this concept, in the fact that they want to alter their verbal communication to make me feel welcome. And that's an example of convergence. Now, divergence is totally different, and that's when individuals stress verbal and nonverbal differences to emphasize their identity. And that would be, for example, if someone with not a Southern accent came up and started talking to me and stress their accent, whether it's a Northern accent, etc., to establish where they're from. And I have caught myself doing that before because I'm very adamant, a Southern belle, very strong-willed and everything like that. But I have caught myself, becoming more Southern and having a stronger dialect and accent just because I was talking to somebody from a different region. And so that stresses non-acceptance in a way. And so that explains, convergence and divergence explains how the communication accommodation theory can be both positive and negative. Now, it's important to note that both of these, convergence and divergence, can exist. Okay, so one person can be accepting of the other, but the other person does not want to accept their acceptance, if that makes sense. But they can also alter during the conversation. And so that's so important to note that although they are both positive and negative aspects of the theory, they can alter to change the conversation or style of communication at any time and any point in the conversation. Now, accommodations, that's a huge part of the theory. First, I want to note that accommodations can be both negative and positive. One aspect of it, first, that we will talk about is the negative concept of accommodations, and that would be over-accommodating. And that is when one person wants to and attempts to overdo efforts by modifying and responding to the other individual to try to avoid their communication disability. They want to adapt to their communication style. And personally, I tutor 2 boys every single afternoon who have learning disabilities, and their teachers take them out of the classroom, and they can tell that they are being over-accommodated for, and they do not like it, and they do not cooperate with it. So it's important to note that over-accommodation exists, and that we should be aware of it whenever we're communicating with others, so that we make each other feel comfortable when we are communicating with one another. Now, it's important to find a balance, because accommodations should be positive. That's the whole concept behind this theory. And, both verbal and nonverbal examples exist. A verbal example of accommodation would be comprehension. Say that the boys that I take care of, Nicholas and Andrew, they have a learning disability, specifically attention, specifically concerning their attention, and their teacher maybe should read aloud or read slower so that they have the ability to comprehend the text being read. And so that's important. That's a positive thing that they can do to learn better. And a nonverbal example would be having interpreters, sound amplifications, visual warning systems, and caption video presentations. That way, people who are not able to verbally communicate can receive the information being taught as well as those who can verbally communicate. Now, it's imperative to note that accommodations occur and that they are important because they relay information properly to those individuals with disabilities and those who cannot verbally communicate, so that they can learn just like anyone else. And so there are strengths and weaknesses of both of the communication accommodation theory. Strengths include letting diverse people with different backgrounds being able to communicate and relate to each other. Also, it provides accommodations to those who cannot properly communicate, which we just talked about. Now, there are also weaknesses to this theory. Number one, it's not always effective, and it may not be appropriate. And also, the second weakness would be the practicality of the communication accommodation theory, because it does not address whenever conflict can occur. So, just the rationality of the theory, the practicality of the theory. Next, we will talk about the value, how important this theory is. It's so important to realize that accommodations are necessary and should occur, because this theory improves society and interaction between different people groups, and it provides adaptations and accommodations so that we can communicate with one another properly. Lastly, after informing you about this amazing theory that Howie Giles came up with, I would love to address the beautiful biblical example in the Old Testament. Moses actually had a speech problem and could not communicate properly, and he did not see himself fit to verbally communicate with the children of Israel, and he prayed that God would send him somebody else. And so God sent him Aaron to be the spokesman for Moses to the children of Israel. And so it's so great to see that biblical examples exist and can correlate and correspond with this amazing theory, the communication accommodation theory. Thank you so much for listening to my video, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.